A woman who was wrongly convicted faces abuse and betrayal from other prisoners and even corrupt guards. And the way she takes revenge leaves everyone in shock. But before we move on to the video, don't forget to subscribe and like. Emma Collins sat frozen in the courtroom, her hands trembling under the table. She barely heard the judge reading out her sentence over the muffled roar in her ears. 7 years. 7 years in a state correctional facility for embezzlement. A crime she didn't commit. Her eyes flicked briefly to her younger sister, Rachel, sitting in the back of the courtroom, tears streaking her face. Emma couldn't let her sister know the truth, that taking this sentence was the only way to protect her. The prosecutor had been ruthless, painting Emma as a greedy teacher who had stolen funds meant for the underprivileged kids at her school. The evidence was damning, but Emma knew it was fabricated. The real culprit, Principal Margaret Hensley, had threatened to expose a devastating secret about Rachel if Emma didn't take the fall. With no way out, Emma had reluctantly sacrificed her freedom. 2 weeks later, Emma found herself in the back of a prisoner transport van, her wrists cuffed tightly and her heart pounding with fear. The other women in the van stared at her with blank, hard eyes, sizing her up silently. Emma kept her gaze down, clutching the last shred of courage she had left. When the van finally pulled into the gates of Blackridge Correctional Facility, the sight of the towering barbed wire fences and the cold, concrete walls made Emma's stomach churn. She was ushered through intake processing, stripped of her belongings, and handed a drab gray jumpsuit with her inmate number stamped across the chest. Everything about the process was dehumanizing. The guards were indifferent, barking orders at her as she tried to keep up with the line of new arrivals. Emma felt the first sting of humiliation when one of the guards, Officer Reynolds, smirked at her during the body search. "Fresh meat," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the other guards to hear. They chuckled, and Emma felt her cheeks burn with shame. As she was led to her cell block, the cacophony of prison life overwhelmed her senses. Voices echoed through the narrow corridors, blending with the clang of metal doors and the shouts of guards. Her cellmate, a middle-aged woman named Marlene, greeted her with a curt nod but little else. The air in the tiny cell was thick with tension, and Emma spent her first night curled up on the lumpy mattress, staring at the ceiling, trying to hold back tears. The following days were a blur of misery. The prison was a world of unspoken rules and silent threats. Emma quickly learned to avoid the communal showers after witnessing a violent altercation. In the mess hall, she sat alone, acutely aware of the stares from the other inmates. Among them was Carla Red Johnson, a tall, muscular woman with a shaved head and piercing green eyes. Carla ruled the prison with an iron fist, her gang of loyal followers ready to enforce her dominance at a moment's notice. Carla noticed Emma immediately. "What's this? A little lamb in the lion's den?" she sneered, her voice dripping with mockery. Emma tried to avoid her gaze, but Carla wasn't the type to be ignored. She knocked Emma's tray out of her hands, sending her meal splattering across the floor. Laughter erupted around her, and Emma felt her face flush with humiliation. "You'll learn quick, sweetheart," Carla said, leaning in close. "In here, you either fight or you crawl. And I don't think you're much of a fighter." Emma's silence seemed to amuse Carla, who walked away laughing with her gang. The guards stood by, uninterested in intervening. Emma clenched her fists under the table, feeling a mix of fear and anger bubbling inside her. Days turned into weeks, and Emma struggled to adjust. She was assigned to work in the administrative office, filing paperwork under the supervision of the prison's warden, Sylvia Hayes. Sylvia was a sharp-dressed woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor. On the surface, she appeared professional, but Emma quickly sensed an undercurrent of manipulation in her every action. It didn't take long for Sylvia to single Emma out. "You've got a head on your shoulders," she said one day, handing Emma a stack of files. "Use it well, and you might make your time here a little easier." Emma didn't realize until later that Sylvia's words were less of an encouragement and more of a veiled threat. The warden had a reputation for running the prison like her personal empire, and Emma soon found herself caught in Sylvia's web. She was ordered to organize financial records that didn't add up, But when she questioned them, Sylvia's tone turned icy. "Do what you're told, Collins," Sylvia warned, "or you'll find yourself in solitary." Emma felt trapped. The work she was being forced to do reeked of corruption, but refusing wasn't an option. Meanwhile, her interactions with the other inmates grew more hostile. Carla and her gang cornered Emma in the laundry room one afternoon, shoving her against a wall. "You think you're better than us? Huh?" Carla snarled. "Working up in the warden's office? Playing teacher's pet?" Emma tried to defend herself, but Carla slapped her hard across the face, leaving her cheeks stinging. "Keep your head down, lamb," Carla hissed. "This is my kingdom." That night, Emma lay awake, her cheeks still burning and her body aching from the laundry room confrontation. She thought about Rachel and the life she'd left behind. Every part of her wanted to give up, but a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that she couldn't. Not yet. As the fluorescent lights buzzed softly above her, Emma clenched her fists under the thin blanket. She didn't know how, but she vowed to survive. Emma's days in Blackridge blurred together into a rhythm of monotony and quiet dread. She avoided eye contact with the guards and inmates, kept her head down during meals, and worked tirelessly in the warden's office. But no matter how much she tried to stay invisible, the prison's undercurrent of hostility always found her. The bruises on her arms from Carla's last encounter had faded, but the humiliation lingered. Every time Emma walked into the mess hall, she felt Carla's gaze piercing through her. The other inmates either laughed at her expense or looked away, unwilling to draw Carla's ire by associating with her. It was during one of these bleak, quiet moments that Emma began to notice something strange about the financial records Sylvia Hayes had her sorting. The files were a mess of incomplete numbers, handwritten notes, and vague transactions. At first, Emma thought it was simple disorganization, but the more she worked, the clearer it became. These numbers didn't add up by accident. Emma kept her observations to herself, careful not to show any sign of suspicion. The guards stationed in the office were more loyal to Sylvia than to the prison system, and she didn't know who she could trust. But the seed of an idea began to form in her mind. These records might be her way out. Her chance to dig deeper came a few weeks later, during a late-night shift in the warden's office. Sylvia had assigned her to stay behind and finish filing reports, a task she suspected was less about efficiency and more about punishment for being too slow the previous day. Alone in the quiet office, Emma glanced over her shoulder, her heart pounding as she opened one of the locked drawers Sylvia always kept closed. Inside, Emma found a trove of incriminating evidence: falsified financial statements, records of bribes from local contractors, and emails between Sylvia and her cronies. Emma's breath caught as she realized the extent of Sylvia's corruption. This wasn't just about skimming funds. Sylvia was running a full-blown operation, exploiting prisoners for cheap labor and pocketing the profits. She quickly copied what she could into a small notebook she had smuggled from the supply room. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start building a case. She slipped the files back into the drawer just as the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Emma barely had time to compose herself before the door swung open, and Officer Reynolds stepped inside. "What are you still doing here, Collins?" he asked, his tone sharp and condescending. "Just finishing up, sir," Emma replied, forcing calm into her voice. Reynolds stared at her for a moment before stepping closer, his eyes narrowing. "You're a smart one," he muttered. "Too smart for your own good." Emma said nothing, her hands gripping the edge of the desk as Reynolds leaned closer. "Watch yourself," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "The warden doesn't like people poking around where they don't belong." When he finally left, Emma released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She knew she had to be careful. Sylvia and her loyalists wouldn't hesitate to silence her if they suspected she was onto them. The next day, as Emma sat alone in the yard during the brief recreation period, Carla approached her once again. This time, there was no sneer or mocking tone, just a cold, predatory smile. "You've been busy," Carla said, sitting down across from her. "Word gets around fast in here, Collins. You're working late in the warden's office. What are you up to?" Emma felt her stomach twist. Carla wasn't stupid. She'd picked up on Emma's movements and likely wanted leverage. "I'm just doing what I'm told," Emma replied evenly, trying to mask her nerves. Carla leaned in, her eyes narrowing. Don't lie to me. If you're making moves in my prison, I need to know. This isn't your prison, Emma said before she could stop herself. The words were quiet but firm, and they seemed to surprise Carla. For a moment, the other woman stared at her, and then she let out a sharp laugh. You've got some fire in you after all, Carla said, standing up. But let me make one thing clear. Step on my toes, and I'll make you regret it. As Carla walked away, Emma felt the weight of her words sink in. She was treading dangerous waters, caught between Sylvia's corruption and Carla's power. But for the first time since she'd entered Blackridge, Emma felt a spark of defiance growing inside her. That spark was tested later that week when Carla cornered Emma in the laundry room. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 members of her gang flanked her, blocking the exit. I warned you, didn't I? Carla said, her voice low and menacing. You think you're better than us working for the warden? You think you can climb out of this hole? Before Emma could respond, Carla shoved her hard against the wall. Pain exploded in her back as her head hit the cold concrete. The other women laughed, but Emma's mind raced. You don't want to do this, Emma said, her voice trembling but steady. Sylvia doesn't care about any of us. She's just using us for her own gain. You're playing her game, Carla. For a moment, Carla hesitated, her expression unreadable. But then she shook her head and stepped back. You're pathetic, she spat, motioning for her gang to follow her. You're not worth the trouble. Emma collapsed to the floor as they left, her body aching and her resolve shaken. But as she sat there, staring at the piles of laundry around her, she realized something. Carla might have power, but she was just as much a pawn in Sylvia's game as anyone else. That night, as Emma lay in her bunk, bruised and exhausted, she made a decision. She couldn't let fear control her anymore. Sylvia's corruption ran deep, but it wasn't unbreakable. If she could find a way to expose it, if she could rally others to her side, she might have a chance. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt a sliver of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. Emma's bruises ached as she walked to her morning work assignment in Sylvia Hayes' office. Every step reminded her of Carla's warning and the precarious position she was in, but her resolve had crystallized. She couldn't continue living as a pawn, pushed around by Carla and exploited by Sylvia. Something had to change. She began studying her surroundings more closely, her teacher's mind cataloging every detail. Sylvia's movements, the guard schedules, and the subtle dynamics of power between inmates all became pieces of a puzzle Emma was determined to solve. She realized that her survival and the possibility of escape from Sylvia's web depended on understanding the game being played around her. One morning, while filing financial reports in the office, Emma was approached by Mary, an older inmate who had been quietly observing her for weeks. Mary, with her graying hair and weathered face, had a reputation as someone who knew how to navigate Blackridge without drawing too much attention. You're walking a fine line, kid, Mary said, her voice low as she pretended to sort papers. People are starting to notice you're not as meek as you look. Emma tensed. I'm just trying to keep my head down and do my time, she replied, her voice equally quiet. Mary raised an eyebrow. Don't play coy with me. I've seen the way you're watching Sylvia, the way you're watching everyone. You've got a plan brewing. Emma hesitated but decided to take a chance. What if I do? She asked. What if I want to bring her down? Mary gave a dry chuckle. Ambitious, dangerous, but not impossible. She leaned in slightly. You'll need allies, though. Nobody makes it out of here alone. Not against someone like Sylvia. Over the next few days, Mary became an unexpected mentor to Emma, teaching her how to navigate the unspoken rules of Blackridge. Mary introduced her to other inmates who had been victims of Sylvia's exploitation, women who had been forced into unpaid labor, manipulated into dangerous situations, or left to take the fall for the warden's schemes. One of these women was Linda, a soft-spoken mother of 2 who had been coerced into smuggling contraband for Sylvia. Linda had been caught and punished, while Sylvia escaped unscathed. Linda's story fueled Emma's determination, and she began to quietly rally these women, planting the seeds of resistance. Meanwhile, Emma continued to collect evidence against Sylvia, taking greater risks as her confidence grew. Late one night, during another solitary shift in the office, she found a set of emails on Sylvia's computer detailing bribes paid to local officials. Emma copied them into her notebook, her hands shaking as she worked. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Carla confronted her again in the yard, this time without her usual smug demeanor. "You're stirring up trouble, Collins," Carla said, crossing her arms. "Sylvia's starting to ask questions. And when she gets nervous, people get hurt." Emma held her ground, meeting Carla's gaze. "Why do you care? You're part of the problem." Carla's eyes narrowed. "Don't push me, lamb. I've got more to lose than you think." For a moment, Emma saw a flicker of vulnerability in Carla's expression, a crack in the tough facade. It was enough to make Emma wonder if Carla's loyalty to Sylvia was as solid as it seemed. That evening, Mary approached Emma with a guarded look. "Word is you've been getting under Carla's skin. That's dangerous." "I think there's more to Carla than she lets on," Emma said thoughtfully. "If I can turn her against Sylvia, it could change everything." Mary frowned. "That's a long shot. But if anyone can pull it off, it's you." Emma spent the next few weeks carefully observing Carla, looking for opportunities to plant doubt about Sylvia's intentions. She subtly pointed out inconsistencies in Sylvia's promises and highlighted how Carla was being used as a pawn. At first, Carla dismissed her, but over time, Emma noticed a shift in Carla's demeanor, a hesitation, a shadow of doubt. At the same time, Emma began communicating with a journalist named Ethan Gray, using a smuggled cell phone Mary had helped her acquire. Ethan was known for exposing corruption in government institutions, and he was intrigued by Emma's story. She provided him with copies of the documents she'd gathered, hoping he could use them to build a case against Sylvia. "You're taking a big risk," Ethan said during one of their covert calls. "I don't have a choice," Emma replied. "If I stay quiet, Sylvia wins. If I fight, at least there's a chance." One night, as Emma lay in her bunk, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The woman she had been when she entered Blackridge, a scared, naive teacher, felt like a distant memory. She was still afraid, but now that fear fueled her determination. Her growing network of allies, her careful manipulation of Carla, and her connection to Ethan were all pieces of a larger plan. She didn't know if it would work, but she knew she couldn't stop now. For the first time, Emma felt like she was in control of her own fate. The tension in Blackridge Correctional Facility was palpable. Weeks of careful planning and subtle manipulation were coming to a head. Emma knew the risks of what she was about to do, but she also knew there was no turning back. Sylvia Hayes had built her empire on fear and exploitation, and Emma was determined to bring it crashing down. Her first move was to destabilize Sylvia's control by targeting the fragile alliances that kept the prison in line. With Mary's help, Emma had spread whispers among the rival gangs about Sylvia's favoritism toward Carla. The rumors spread like wildfire, creating fractures within the inmate hierarchy. Carla, once untouchable, began to face challenges to her authority. The leader of a rival gang, Vanessa Veith Carter, openly confronted her in the yard, accusing her of being Sylvia's lapdog. The confrontation escalated into a fight, with the guards intervening just in time to break it up. Emma watched from a distance, her heart pounding. She felt a pang of guilt for using Carla as a pawn, but she reminded herself that it was necessary. Every crack in Sylvia's power structure brought her closer to justice. Meanwhile, Emma continued feeding evidence to Ethan Gray, the journalist she'd contacted. Ethan had already begun piecing together a story about corruption at Blackridge, and Emma knew that once it went public, it would be impossible for Sylvia to maintain her grip on the prison. But Emma's actions hadn't gone unnoticed. Sylvia was becoming increasingly paranoid, and her once calm facade was starting to crumble. During a staff meeting, she barked orders at the guards, demanding tighter control over the inmates and threatening severe punishment for anyone who stepped out of line. One evening, as Emma walked back to her cell, she was intercepted by Officer Reynolds. His smirk was gone, replaced by a grim expression. "The warden's watching you, Collins," he said. his tone low and menacing. "If you're smart, you'll keep your head down and stay out of trouble." Emma met his gaze with a calm she didn't feel. "I'm just doing my time," she said evenly. Reynolds leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Don't play games with me. You've stirred up enough already." Emma said nothing, walking away with her heart racing. She knew Sylvia was closing in, but she couldn't afford to stop now. The tipping point came during a prison-wide inspection. Sylvia had ordered a surprise raid on the cells, hoping to uncover contraband or evidence of dissent. Emma's heart sank as she watched the guards tear through her belongings, but to her relief, they didn't find the notebook where she'd hidden her notes and copies of Sylvia's files. The raid, however, pushed the inmates to the brink. Tensions that had been simmering for weeks finally boiled over, and a fight broke out in the mess hall the next day. Emma saw her chance. She stood on a table in the middle of the chaos, her voice rising above the shouts and clatter of trays. "This isn't about us," she yelled. "It's about them. Sylvia's the one pulling the strings." For a moment, the room fell silent. Inmates turned to look at her, their faces a mixture of confusion and anger. "She's using all of us," Emma continued, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "She doesn't care about any of us. She's lining her pockets while we suffer." Vanessa Carter was the first to respond. "Why should we trust you?" she demanded. "Because I have proof," Emma said, holding up a stack of copied documents. "And I have a way to get it out." The room erupted again, but this time, it wasn't chaos. It was a wave of agreement, a shared determination to take back control. The next few days were a blur of action. With Mary's help, Emma coordinated a plan to expose Sylvia's corruption while simultaneously orchestrating a peaceful protest that would attract media attention. Inmates refused to work, forcing the guards to take drastic measures. Sylvia's frustration reached a boiling point. She stormed into the mess hall, flanked by guards, and demanded an end to the rebellion. "You think you can challenge me?" she shouted. "You're nothing without me." Emma stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Your time is up, Sylvia. The world's going to know what you've done." At that moment, Ethan Gray's article hit the news. Emma had managed to get a letter smuggled out, detailing the corruption and attaching copies of the documents she'd collected. The article named names, exposed Sylvia's network, and called for an investigation into Blackridge. The fallout was immediate. State officials arrived at the prison within hours, demanding answers. Guards loyal to Sylvia began abandoning her, unwilling to go down with her sinking ship. Carla, who had been watching the chaos unfold from the sidelines, approached Emma with a grudging respect. "I didn't think you had it in you," she said. "But you did good." Emma gave her a small, weary smile. "It's not over yet." That night, as the prison descended into chaos, Sylvia attempted to flee. Emma, anticipating the move, had tipped off one of the investigating officials. Sylvia was intercepted at the gates, her desperate pleas falling on deaf ears as she was placed in handcuffs. The inmates watched as she was led away, a mixture of relief and triumph in their expressions. For the first time, Emma felt a glimmer of hope that real change was possible. But as she returned to her cell that night, exhausted and bruised, she knew her fight wasn't over. The system that had allowed Sylvia to thrive was still in place, and Emma was determined to keep fighting, no matter the cost. The air in Blackridge Correctional Facility felt different the next morning. The oppressive weight that had hung over the prison for years seemed to have lifted. Sylvia Hayes was gone, hauled away in handcuffs after her corruption was exposed to the world. For the first time since Emma had arrived, the inmates walked through the corridors with something resembling hope. Emma sat on her bunk, staring at the notebook in her lap. It was the same one she'd used to record every piece of evidence against Sylvia, the same one she'd risked everything to keep hidden. The edges were worn, the pages smudged from constant handling, but it represented so much more than just a collection of documents. It was her lifeline, her weapon, and now her victory. That afternoon, state investigators arrived to interview the inmates. Emma was called into a small, sterile room where a man in a crisp suit introduced himself as Agent Daniels. He flipped through a thick file of papers as she sat down across from him. "You've stirred up quite a storm here, Miss Collins," he said, his tone neutral but curious. Emma nodded. "It wasn't just me. Everyone in this place has suffered because of Sylvia and the system she built." Daniel studied her for a moment before leaning back in his chair. "The evidence you provided is damning. Sylvia will be facing charges for embezzlement, bribery, and abuse of power. And that's just the beginning." A flicker of relief passed through Emma, but she kept her expression calm. "What about the others? The guards who helped her? The officials who turned a blind eye?" "We're pursuing all leads," Daniels assured her. "But your role in this, it's remarkable. You've done something most people wouldn't dare to try." Emma wasn't sure how to respond to that. She didn't feel remarkable, just tired. In the days that followed, the changes at Blackridge came swiftly. Investigators removed corrupt guards from their posts, bringing in temporary replacements while a broader review of the facility was conducted. Inmates who had been forced into Sylvia's schemes were reassigned to fairer work programs, and the overall atmosphere of the prison began to shift. Emma's role in the rebellion didn't go unnoticed. Many of the women who had once ignored or mocked her now approached her with quiet gratitude. Even Carla, who had spent weeks tormenting her, offered an olive branch. "You proved me wrong, Collins," Carla said one afternoon in the yard. "I didn't think you had it in you." Emma shrugged. "I didn't think I did either." Carla smirked. "Guess you've got more fight in you than I gave you credit for." Their truce wasn't exactly friendship, but it was enough. A month later, Emma was called to the warden's office, now occupied by an interim administrator sent by the state. She sat across from the new warden, a stern but fair woman named Margaret Lane, who held a stack of documents in her hands. "Ms. Collins, I've reviewed your case," Warden Lane said. "And given the circumstances, the state has decided to commute your sentence. You'll be released immediately." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "Released? You've served more than enough time," Lane said firmly. "And your cooperation in exposing Sylvia Hayes' corruption has earned you a second chance." Emma didn't know whether to cry or laugh. After everything she'd endured, freedom felt almost impossible to imagine. The day Emma walked out of Blackridge, the sky was a bright, endless blue. She clutched a small bag of her belongings as she stepped through the gates, blinking against the sunlight. Waiting for her on the other side was Rachel. Rachel ran to her, tears streaming down her face as she threw her arms around Emma. "You're free," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're finally free." Emma held her sister tightly, her own tears spilling over. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. In the weeks that followed, Emma worked tirelessly to rebuild her life. She moved in with Rachel and found work at a nonprofit organization that supported women affected by the justice system. Drawing on her own experiences, Emma became a fierce advocate for prison reform, speaking out against the corruption and systemic failures that had led to her wrongful imprisonment. Her story gained national attention, and people began to see her not as a criminal, but as a survivor and a fighter. She used her platform to amplify the voices of those still trapped in the system, determined to make sure their stories weren't forgotten. One evening, as she sat in her small apartment, Emma received a call from Ethan Gray. "I just wanted to say thank you," Ethan said. "Your story's already making waves. People are paying attention." Emma smiled, leaning back in her chair. "This isn't just my story," she said. "It's theirs too. And it's far from over." The next day, Emma stood in front of a packed room at a conference on criminal justice reform. She spoke with a quiet but unwavering determination, her voice carrying the weight of her experiences and the hope she now carried for the future. As she looked out at the faces in the audience, she saw a spark of understanding in their eyes. She wasn't just telling her story, she was igniting change. Emma Collins had risen from the ashes of her past, stronger and more determined than ever. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a phoenix, blazing a path forward for others to follow.